On a tall wooden scaffold, surrounded by jeering crowds, stood Hugh Despenser the Younger, his face gaunt from starvation, his garments in tatters, and his fate sealed. Once second only to the king himself, Hugh was about to suffer a death so savage it would be remembered for centuries. It was the 24th of November, 1326. The air in Hereford crackled with anticipation. Thousands gathered in the town square, nobles in silks, clergy in robes, and peasants in rough woolens, all drawn together for a single purpose: to witness the brutal downfall of a man who had once ruled England from behind the throne. But how did this man rise so high, only to fall so hard? The answer lies in a tangled web of ambition, manipulation, sexuality, and betrayal that defined early 14th century England. Born around 1286, into one of England's noble families, Hugh Despenser the Younger was the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder and Isabella de Beauchamp, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick. From birth, Hugh was steeped in politics and power. His father served King Edward I loyally, and the family's connections paved the way for young Hugh's future at court. Educated in the traditions of nobility, trained in chivalry, and steeped in courtly ambition, Hugh was groomed for high office. But even among the ambitious, Hugh stood out. He had a sharp mind, a hunger for influence, and a willingness to bend the rules. When King Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, Hugh saw his chance. Edward was a very different king from his formidable father. Sensitive, artistic, and emotionally dependent, Edward had a history of favoring male companions, most infamously Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, with his arrogance and flamboyance, caused uproar among England's barons, who resented his influence. They saw him as a corrupting force, using his closeness with the king to humiliate the nobility. In 1312, this resentment boiled over. A group of angry barons captured and executed Gaveston. The power vacuum left by Gaveston's death presented a golden opportunity for an ambitious man like Hugh Despenser. By 1316, Hugh had become a close confidant of the king. Edward appointed him royal chamberlain, a position that gave Hugh intimate access to the monarch. Their relationship deepened quickly. Whether their bond was romantic or platonic remains debated by historians. But it is clear that Hugh gained the king's unwavering trust and affection. With the king's favor came privilege. Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, Edward's niece, and gained vast lands in Glamorgan, Wales. This marriage not only cemented his position at court, but also gave him access to immense wealth and resources. As the years passed, Hugh's grip on power tightened. He used his royal connection to expand his land holdings aggressively, often at the expense of others. He manipulated court decisions, forced nobles to forfeit estates, and even exploited widows and relatives. His methods were not just bold, they were ruthless. One of his more infamous acts was coercing his own sister-in-law into handing over her lands. His hunger for control knew no familial bounds. In 1321, during a baronial uprising against the Despensers, Hugh was briefly exiled, but rather than lie low, he turned to piracy, raiding English ships in defiance of the very crown he claimed to serve. Despite his exile, Edward II remained loyal. When the rebellion was quashed in 1322, Hugh returned to court with more authority than ever. Over the next 4 years, the Despensers' father and son didn't just advise the king. They became the government. Hugh, the Younger, controlled the royal purse, dictated appointments, and enforced laws to serve his personal agenda. To the common people and nobility alike, it seemed Hugh had become the shadow monarch. Chroniclers described him as King of England in all but name. But such power comes with a price. The more Hugh accumulated, the more enemies he made. Love, hatred, and war. Among those enemies was Queen Isabella, wife of Edward II. Once respected as a diplomatic and poised figure, Isabella grew increasingly marginalized by Hugh's dominance over her husband. Not only had her political influence been stripped away, but her personal rights were also attacked. Hugh confiscated her lands, removed her allies from court, and even took custody of her children, placing them under the care of his wife, Eleanor. To a queen and a mother, this was more than insult, it was war. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, the French king. There, away from the Despensers' reach, she found an unlikely ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had once been imprisoned for opposing Hugh, but had escaped to the continent. Their alliance, romantic and strategic, would change the course of English history. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began plotting a return to England. not just to remove the Despensers, but to dethrone Edward II himself. In September 1326, their forces landed in England. Though small in number, their cause was popular. Years of exploitation and cruelty by Hugh had united many barons and commoners against him. Noble houses that had once feared the king now rallied behind the queen. Edward and Hugh fled westward with a handful of loyalists and a significant portion of the royal treasury. But it was a doomed escape. Their allies deserted them, towns refused them entry, and supplies dwindled. Hugh, the elder, was captured in Bristol and executed immediately. His body was mutilated, hanged in armor, beheaded, and fed to dogs. It was a gruesome warning to those who still supported the regime. Edward and Hugh the Younger continued their desperate escape through the wilderness of Wales, but their luck had run out. In mid-November, they were captured near Neath and taken into custody. Edward would later be forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son, Edward III. But for Hugh Despenser, the punishment would be far more severe. He had stopped eating in prison, hoping to die before facing judgment. But starvation failed him. On the 24th of November, 1326, he was hauled in front of a tribunal led by Isabella, Mortimer, and a group of barons who had long thirsted for revenge. The charges against Hugh were extensive: treason, theft, corruption, abuse of power, and manipulation of the king. The trial was swift, more theatrical than legal. The outcome had already been decided. His sentence would not just be death, it would be a public spectacle. That morning, the people of Hereford flooded the marketplace. A tall ladder was erected so all could see the man who had once ruled from the shadows. A crown of nettles was thrust onto Hugh's head, mocking the authority he had claimed. Verses from scripture condemning pride and wickedness were painted on his body. Then came the torture. According to chroniclers, Hugh's genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes. His stomach was opened, and his intestines pulled out and fed into flames while he was still alive. The crowd, hungry for revenge, cheered as his screams filled the square. Finally, he was hanged until dead. His body was then beheaded, quartered, and distributed to cities across England. His head was placed on a spike atop London's gates. It was one of the most savage executions in British history, designed not just to punish, but to purge. The message was clear: Hugh Despenser had corrupted the crown, defied God's order, and violated the social structure. And for that, he would not be allowed even a dignified death. Legacy, legend, and justice. Still, even sympathetic historians acknowledge that Hugh was no saint. His political maneuvering, land grabbing, and disregard for noble rights made him many enemies. His downfall, while horrific, was not entirely unprovoked. In a strange twist of fate, the very people who orchestrated Hugh's death would soon face similar consequences. In the years that followed, Hugh Despenser's name became synonymous with greed, cruelty, and ambition. For many, he embodied everything wrong with Edward II's reign. Even centuries later, his legacy remains stained. But history is rarely simple. Modern scholars have begun to reassess the man behind the myth. Was Hugh truly the monster medieval chroniclers made him out to be? Or was he a victim of political spin, condemned not just for his crimes, but for who he was close to? His alleged romantic relationship with Edward II, whether real or imagined, became a convenient excuse for his enemies to label him a sodomite, a term that carried both religious condemnation and social stigma in medieval England. In that era, such accusations were more than insults, they were tools used to destroy reputations and justify executions. In 1330, Edward III, now a teenager, seized control from his mother Isabella and her lover Mortimer. Mortimer was tried for treason, and hanged though spared the public torture Hugh had endured. Isabella was imprisoned, but eventually released and lived out her days in relative comfort. The wheel of fortune had turned once more. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Hugh Despenser's story had become the subject of plays, poems, and political commentary. He was cast in many roles: villain, tyrant, pervert, victim, and in modern times, he's been voted one of the worst Britons of the 14th century. Yet, his tale remains a valuable mirror. It reflects the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of rulers to manipulation, and the brutal ways in which justice was once dispensed. For years after his death, Hugh's widow, Eleanor Spone, was finally allowed to collect what little remained of her husband: a head, a femur, and a few bones. She buried him quietly on family lands in Gloucestershire. Edward II's own fate was equally dark. In 1327, He was murdered allegedly by the infamous method of a red-hot poker inserted into his body. Whether true or not, the symbolism was clear. This was punishment for a relationship considered an affront to God and King. Today, historians continue to debate both men's lives and deaths. But one thing is certain: Hugh Despenser's rise and fall encapsulates the raw, often terrifying nature of medieval politics. The king's favorite, who once held a kingdom in his palm, ended up torn apart before a cheering crowd. And even now, nearly 700 years later, his story remains a chilling reminder of what happens when ambition, power, and vengeance collide.